Hello, class. So for this session, we're going to do something that I normally never do, and that I don't like doing, and that's kind of skim the surface of history, and do a whole bunch in just a short amount of time. I think you can probably tell from the way I run the course that we do a bit more of a, let's say, a deep dive when we look at certain movements. Like I like to get into specifics, but for this class, we're going to do something a little different, and it can actually be fun and a little freeing. So we're going to go through the whole history of the 20th century, of 20th century art history, only Western art history, and I'm going to give it to you in 17 different objects, one after the other, with like a key date, right, for that for when that object comes out, and it'll be associated with a specific movement. So of course this won't be comprehensive, and of course it's only Western, but still I think it's a nice overview and a good entry point for the 20th century. So without further ado, let's go to our first stopping point, which is 1905. It's an important date because you have the first avant-garde, 20th century avant-garde movement that comes our way, and that's Fauvism. And you've probably heard of the artist most associated with Fauvism. That's Henri Matisse, a French painter. This is his very famous, striking painting, The Joy of Life, Le Bonheur de Vivre in French. And he paints this in 1905, 1906, just after this moment of Fauvism. So Fauvism was a form of painting that shocked a lot of people. It was a very, very expressive use of color, and of line, and of composition. That was radically new, really quite explosive, quite iconoclastic. So Matisse is probably most associated with color. He's an incredible colorist, and you can tell from this painting his use of color is. This is just the pre-production, right? If you saw this in person, you would really be affected by the color. And he's one of the first to use color in an arbitrary sort of way. So using color not simply to represent the world, like this tree or that landscape or this the human figure needs to be the color or the pigment that matches what we see with our human eyes. He sort of uses color for its own properties. So clearly you've never seen a landscape that's lemon yellow, bright acid lemon yellow. You've never seen a sky and a forest set up with this incredible use of color. So he's one of the first to sort of, in some ways, we could call it liberating color from having to represent the world. And this is an incredibly important development in the history of Western painting, because the history of 20th century painting, as it moves forward from the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th, is an increasing experimentation with paint as a medium, especially when it comes to color. So he's doing something really, really new here. And he wants color to be its own mood, its own feeling on the viewer, right? And he wants you to be aware of color, which is to say to be aware of paint in ways that maybe you normally aren't, because you're seeing a representation of something and you think of the representation and not the medium, not the thing that's allowing you to see that thing. So it's really important. There are some scholars who've analyzed this painting that Matisse has gone, and he's referencing the whole history of Western painting here, from the Renaissance forward. There are all sorts of ways in which these figures allude to the history of painting, of like the 400 years of painting before this in the West, and that he's playing with it, that he's mucking about. He's playing with scale in a way that doesn't make any sense. So perspective is starting to break down here already. So like these figures, it's not clear how the front figures really relate to each other. And then the figures in the back there, like how far away are they here? You can't really get spatial distance. So he's playing with form, he's playing with perspective. And there's some scholars that have noted when it comes to the human body, he's playing with gender, and he's playing with the human form. So if there's one thing that's really anchored the history of Western painting, is that it was very clear what the gender roles were. Like these are women and these are men, right? And usually the men are the one doing the representation, or the representing are the ones that are active, and the women are more passive and nude, and they're the ones being objectified. They're the ones being represented in paint. But there are scholars that have gone into this painting, and they notice, well, actually, there's all this gender fluidity in all these figures, which would be like the breakdown of Western perspective. This breaks down like a key category for Western art. So you can tell right off the bat, we start with Fauvism, we start with Matisse. The 20th century is all about challenging the past and breaking towards new forms and new ideas. That's going to be the recurring theme of much of the 20th century. And so when we go to 1910, we have probably the most famous movement of the early 20th century, and that's Cubism, and you've probably heard of Cubism before. This is where we get to Picasso, one of the most important painters of the 20th century. This is his portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. It's important to realize and to make a note that Picasso is not alone when it comes to the breakthroughs that Cubism represents. He's working in tandem with Braque. Braque was just as important for this development of Cubism. And for the longest time, Cubism was thought to be a breakdown of Western perspective, far more than Matisse, because here, what a lot of people have argued or have thought is that Picasso is giving you more than one perspective at once. And in fact, he's giving you so many different perspectives that you start to lose sense of objectivity, weirdly enough. You start to lose sense of what you're seeing and the world around you as it's normally represented through paint. So think about it. If you look at a chair, you see it from one perspective. But now imagine seeing that same chair from 10 different perspectives all at once. Our brains aren't quite wired for that, right? It would become this fragmented, chaotic thing, let alone, let's say, 50 perspectives, right? So one of the original readings of Cubism is that it was like giving you multiple perspectives at once. That hasn't really held up as the proper interpretation of what they were doing here. So you had some art historians more recently argue that what Braque and Picasso were trying to do was, yes, break down the history of Western perspective, but not by giving you multiple perspectives all at once. They were trying to do two things that are actually irreconcilable. One of which is to represent the world naturalistically, as almost all the painting we looked at in this class does, but then also show you the paint and the physical surface and the flatness and the shape of the canvas and of the paint itself. So it's both a mirror onto the world, a representation of the world, but also calling attention to its own materiality, to the fact that it's paint, that it's line, that it's canvas, that it's flat, right? You can tell how these are almost irreconcilable, right? So at some point you get a little bit of a figure, you get a little bit of depth, but then the way in which it's composed, and you have all these cubes, like this explosion of different cubic forms, all of a sudden then it becomes more shallow and it becomes flat, and you start to see the surface of the painting. And so maybe that's a little less fun, it could be like a little less intriguing than multiple perspectives, but it seems to be more along the lines of what they were trying to do. What I find really cool is you have some scholars who say and notice that Cubism is developed, Braque and Picasso are developing Cubism in the early decade of the 20th century, right around the time you have Einstein working in his patent office, developing the theory of relativity, which itself works in such a way that the only thing we have in physics that's absolute, that's non-relative, is the speed of light. Everything else is relative to each other, right? Every point is relative to another point. It's not. We don't have a center of the universe. Position, even time and space itself, is relative. The only thing that's constant is the speed of light. So then you start to think of reality as, well, multiple perspectives, or dependent on where you are. Quantum mechanics is also starting to be developed in this period, especially in the teens into the 30s. So we're coming to find in the early 20th century that the physical reality, like the desk that I'm sitting at, the microphone I'm talking into, even my own body, at the level of at the quantum level, at the level of like what my electrons, what everything is doing, it's a completely different world from the Newtonian world. That's gravity, that's constant, that's dependable, that we can sort of rely on. It's much more of a world of probabilities, and it's a much stranger world in some sense if we compare it to our understanding of the everyday world in the more classic Newtonian sense. So there's some scholars that have come along and they say, well, it's weird, like Picasso and Braque, they of course don't know anything about relativity theory, they don't really know anything about quantum mechanics, but there is a way in which painting is breaking down the laws of painting in the same way that these developments in physics, particle physics or theoretical physics, that's also breaking down all these well-established laws that we've had for a couple centuries now, right? So it's a very interesting reading, and I'm probably going on too long with Cubism, but there's a lot there. It's very rich. So when we get to 1917, we get to the artist who's now considered to be maybe the most important Western artist of the 20th century, and that would be Marcel Duchamp. And you're probably wondering, wait a second, this is a photograph of a toilet. This is a urinal. Why are you showing me a urinal? And why are you telling me that Duchamp is the most important artist, Western artist of the 20th century? Well, this would take a whole class to explain properly. But Duchamp is considered to be incredibly important, and Fountain from 1917 is just one of these foundational artworks of the 20th century. So it is a urinal, and he did go out and buy it in a plumbing shop, and he submitted it to an exhibition anonymously, at least under a pseudonym, R. Mutt, and R. Mutt dated 1917. And he submitted to an exhibition that was supposed to be completely democratic. It was an exhibition in 1917 that was supposed to be open to everybody. It would be completely democratic. So it was kind of going against sort of the official art academy of the time. This was in the United States, in New York. And if you just paid a small fee, I think it was like $6, your work of art would be shown. It was an open, completely democratic form of art. And so Duchamp decides, well, if it's completely open, then I'm going to choose a urinal from a shop, and I'm going to submit it to this exhibition. And I think you can probably tell what happened. You had a lot of artists, and you had a lot of people in the art world who were up in arms and did not want to show this. Said it couldn't possibly be considered a work of art. You had other artists that stuck up for it, and they said, according to the byline, according to our rules of this exhibition, we have to show it. That's the democratic principle of our non-juried system here. And so there are all sorts of different ramifications here. One of which is to think of Duchamp almost like hacking a system to show that like a certain set of laws or a certain system that's set up can't be coherent. Like it can't follow its rules all the way through, right? And so there's some interesting ideas that come out of there. But maybe the reason why this work has gone down in history as being so important is because it dared to ask one question that we haven't asked all semester long, and most people do not ask in the art world, and certainly hadn't asked it before the Fountain. And that is, what is art? What is art? Like, this forces you, if you consider this to not be art, then it forces you to say, well, then what is art, right? And then you start to go down this paper trail of, well, art is what people have shown, and it's what institutions have said art should be. It should be a painting, it should be sculpture. At this point, not even photography is really considered to be art yet, right? So it starts to pry open the presumptions and the presuppositions and sort of the belief systems that are held that they seem to be natural, right? But they're not natural. There's a history of Western art. There is a history of its institutions. There's a history of its museums, and there's a power behind what has been shown and what has not been shown, right? And so this object is very thorny for established art history, because you start to realize that there are institutions and there are powers, and there are those who run these institutions who can say and demarcate and limit what is or isn't art, right? So whether or not Duchamp thought that this was actually art is beside the point. It was an instigation for us to question our assumptions and our dogmatic presuppositions about what art even is, right? So it forces us to try to answer this very, very difficult question of, like, not is it beautiful or is it interesting, or does it tell us something about history, you know, all the things we've been doing in this class, but the even harder question, which is, well, what is this thing that is art that we're studying, and that we deem to be important, right? So very, very important object. Duchamp's found from 1917. So now we move on to 1931. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit, otherwise we're going to go way over it. You know, all these movements, all these artists are so interesting that we could have a whole class just on any one of these movements. So this is Surrealism, and many of you probably know Dali, The Persistence of Memory. This is at MoMA, so one day you could see it. It's smaller than you might think. And Dali's a really nice representation of this movement called Surrealism, which starts in France, but it becomes pretty international. And I think you can tell from this painting that it looks more like a dreamscape, right? It's a painting, it's realistic, but it doesn't seem like it's giving you a depiction of the natural world. It's giving you more the depiction of, let's say, one of Dali's dreams, right? So these melting clocks, these bizarre ants coming out of a pocket watch, this very strange gelatinous sea creature that seems to be washed up in this landscape, and then notice like the scale and the lack of sort of spatial coherence here is very much like a dream. I always make an analogy with Inception, if you've seen Christopher Nolan's film Inception, where when they're in a dream, things like can become malleable, like the laws of physics don't really apply in the dream, and you get that very often in Dali. And in a lot of the different artists that were associated with Surrealism. And the reason why dreams are so important for the Surrealists is because Freud was so important for the Surrealists. To talk about Surrealism without psychoanalysis, without Freud, would be to not be able to talk about Surrealism at all. That's how important Freud was for this movement. All these artists read Freud. And if you know anything about the history of psychoanalysis and Freud, his first major work is on the interpretation of dreams, which he publishes in 1899, 1900. It becomes hugely influential, right, for all sorts of different things. And Freud's one of the first to say that, well, we have an unconscious. We have this unconscious material inside us. We don't really have access to it. It dictates what we do sometimes. We have certain symptoms that rise up out of our unconscious. And a lot of times these are traumas that we've repressed and we send them way down. But we don't really have access to the unconscious. It's not like just something you can open up and then like fix, right? You only have indirect access to the unconscious. And of course, one of the ways in which you access the unconscious for a psychoanalyst and for a surrealist is through your dreams. Your dreams will tell you something, but in a very indirect fashion, right? It will tell you something about the deeper truths of your unconscious, but you can't handle those truths if they were just told to you directly. They come in through metaphoric and symbolic different forms, right, in dreams. And so this is what Dali is giving you. And the surrealists overall were interested in the unconscious and in dreams, not simply as a way to sort of psychoanalyze themselves. They did that. But they thought that surreality, that the world of dreams and that of the unconscious could be a revolutionary force in society. So if you ever wake up and if you ever have one day where you think, what is this life? Why am I just trying to get a job so that I can buy things and then just become a happy consumer in this sort of crass materialist society that we live in? If you ever think that, then you're thinking like a surrealist. The surrealists already were not happy with the way modern economies and modern cities and the way in which society was structured, for them it was boring, materialist, and not very interesting. So they thought that through dreams and through the unconscious, you could break out of that, right, and lead to this sort of revolutionary future. Well, unfortunately for the history of the 20th century, by the time you get to the late 30s into the 40s, there are all sorts of cataclysmic events that happen that get in the way of any sort of surrealist revolution towards a better future. There are all sorts of bad things that happen. So think of the Great Depression. This had a huge influence, really, on global history, and especially in the United States. So the Great Depression happens in 1929, and it's devastation. Way worse than what we're experiencing right now. We're experiencing some pretty terrible things right now when it comes to the COVID economy, people going hungry and people losing jobs and losing homes and all these things, right? I mean, we're living in a really dire moment that hopefully will turn around soon. But the Great Depression was even more devastating. And so you had, you may know about the history of the New Deal. You have Roosevelt, which is this incredible stimulus after the Great Depression. And part of the New Deal was getting artists, painters, muralists, and photographers back to work. And so we have this incredible trove of art that comes out of this moment, of this really depressing, horrible moment of economic depression. And maybe the most famous image that comes out of this is Dorothy Lang's Migrant Mother. This was a farmer. She was a pea picker in California. And there was drought, there was hunger, there was famine. It was just a terrible situation. And Dorothy Lang captures this incredible moment of this mother with her two children. Right? So this is a key testament to this moment in time. In 1937, it's not just the Great Depression that's really bothering global history, especially Western history. It's the advent of war. And it's the advent of this horrible war that's just about to start in 1939. In 1937, you have this terrible bombing in Spain, in the Basque region, in a little town called Guernica, which is really one of the first instances, at least in Europe, in European warfare, where civilians were directly targeted. The Nazis, with Hitler already in power here, he's in power starting in 1933, he gets together with a fascist in Spain, headed by Franco, and he helps them. He bombs Guernica. And it's this horrible, horrible thing. And this huge scandal that's in the news. And Picasso is then inspired to paint maybe the greatest anti-war painting that's ever been painted, which is Guernica. So he sees the footage. He hears about the carnage. They basically bombed the market when just women, children were at the market buying things. And so he paints this very visceral, this very bleak painting. It's all really in grayscale, blacks, grays, and whites. And it's sort of this eternal struggle between fascism, which is usually represented by like the bull, and then the electric, this very harsh electric light, and then more Republican ideals. And by Republican, I don't mean the GOP, which arguably do not have Republican ideals anymore, but the idea of a republic, of a democracy that makes up a republic of the people who govern themselves, right? And so you have the people here that, of course, are being bombed, though there's one that's coming in through the window with a natural light, with a candle, trying to offset the more harsh artificial light, which almost looks more like a bomb exploding, right? So there's this eternal struggle between democratic ideals of wanting to have a republic that's of the demos, of the people, and then fascism, which is more of a military, right-wing dictatorship. So it's an incredible anti-war painting, and maybe one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century. If you ever want to see it, it's in Madrid. I've never visited Spain, but I've always wanted to see Spain. So if you ever find yourself in Madrid, you get to see it in person. So by the time you get to the mid-40s, it's unimaginable violence, unimaginable despair, and unimaginable killing on a scale in human history that we'd never seen before. So of course, one of the most harrowing aspects of World War II, and what we end up coming to find in 1944, 45, 46, when images of the death camps come out, is the genocide that is the Holocaust. 6 million Jews and other persecuted minorities in Germany and around Europe were liquidated, were murdered, right, by the Nazis. So you have a lot of philosophers, a lot of thinkers who say that like human history kind of broke the history of the West. It broke its back, like or it just ran out of breath, or had the wind knocked out of it. I mean, you could never recover from this. The scale of the destruction of World War II, and especially the Holocaust, the fact that human beings did this to other human beings, meant that we've reached a new point of history of barbarism that no one could have foreseen. Especially if you think about all the noble ideals of politics and of art and culture, especially beginning in the Enlightenment. No one could have imagined this. Someone like Theodor Adorno, a German philosopher, he very famously said that, he said, after Auschwitz there can be no more poetry. Auschwitz, of course, is one of the most well-known death camps, Holocaust death camps in Germany. And a lot of people have interpreted this in different ways, but one way it can be interpreted is to say, well, we've disqualified ourselves from being able to enjoy anything beautiful. That poetry, to enjoy anything beautiful, to enjoy poetry after humanity has done this, something so horrific, it's just perverse. It doesn't make any sense, right? We've sort of disqualified ourselves. That could be one way to read it. And we see these ideas in the work that's being made around this time. So this is Jean Fautrier, a French painter, who's working during World War II in France, and he's Jewish. And so at one point he has to hide out because the Gestapo is coming to try to find him. And if he does, that means he's going to a camp and he's very likely going to get killed. And he's in this hospital, basically, in the rural France. And he hears the Gestapo come one day, so he hides out. But then he hears them gather up a group of people. They go out into the forest, and he hears gunshots. And he starts to understand that these people are being summarily executed in the forest, in the woods. And it inspires him. It leads him to paint a series, which is a very bleak, brutal, kind of horrifying series, which are called The Hostages. And there are a number of them. So this is just one. But if you study him a little bit more, you'll see he has lots of different ones. This is a head of hostage, number 22. So there are a whole bunch of them, right? And so you get this sense of this is a head, but it's a head that's been like unspeakably maimed, right? It's as if him as a painter, he's like he himself is like maiming this face that's on this canvas, and it seems like muddy. It seems dirty. It's just really quite brutal, right? It also doesn't give you a great sense. Like you almost feel it or hear it more than you see it, right? So in some ways, people have interpreted this as him like trying to recreate his experience of hearing these horrible executions in the woods, and then of course not actually seeing it, right? So it's a very brutal, maybe even harsh and ugly painting, but it is that for a reason, right? Because we're at a really horrible moment in history. Something very different happens when we move to Europe in the post-war period. So while Europe is trying to reconstruct itself, and you have something like the Marshall Plan that allows these devastated European countries to try to reconstruct themselves after the World War, the Allies, the United States, they experience a post-war boom, right? And the United States, it's arguably at this moment where the United States becomes the world superpower that it was for most of the 20th century. And in some ways, the center of culture and of Western art moves from Paris to New York, to our city, right? And this is where we start to get the first leading group of artists are from the United States, are North American. And so you have a group of artists who they'll be known either as the New York School or the Abstract Expressionists. And they started making this work that was completely abstract, that was totally just gestural. It's not representing the world, and it's completely free. And maybe the most famous, and for me, I think still one of the most interesting of the abstract expressionists is Pollock. So he would lay his canvas down. They're massive, massive canvases. If you ever go to MoMA or the Met, you'll see they have a bunch of Pollocks, and they're very, very large. I always equate it to, if you like ambient music, I like to read and work to ambient music, especially like in the morning. Like it's a type of music where you just kind of get immersed into it. You sort of just get lost into it. These fields of gestural painting in a Pollock, I sometimes think like it's the visual equivalent of ambient music. Right? There's no central focus point. It's just this big field of line, color, and shapes and movements that you kind of get lost in. And so, these are wonderful, wonderful paintings. And they've often been read along the lines of already post-war Cold War history, that this represents U.S. freedom, right? Painters are free. There's something about this type of painting that represents the freedom of the individual, and in this case of Pollock, right? So there's a way in which once we get into the 50s, once we get into the Cold War, which pits Western free market capitalism and democracy against the communist Soviet Union, which is more of a controlled, centralized economy, and collective form of existence, which collapsed into a type of dictatorship, especially with Stalin. It was as if abstract expressionism represented the US side of the Cold War, right? Which is really interesting to think about. And then all these movements start to come fast and furious in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of them coming out of the United States. So another major movement would be pop art, and I'm sure everybody knows Andy Warhol. I'm sorry, not Andy Warhol, that's just a typo. But Andy Warhol, this is his Maryland diptych. With pop art, it's one of the first time where you have like material that's considered to be lowbrow culture, like not fine art, not, like fuddy-duddy, which would be like images from like fashion magazines or advertisement, right? Making it into fine art, making it into painting, right? And Warhol was obsessed with pop culture. He was obsessed with music. If you know your history of New York underground music, he had a place called The Factory where they had parties where he did his silk screens or paintings. But he also hosted the Velvet Underground, who worked there. He even supposedly produced one of their records, Velvet Underground and Nico, which is a total classic. Highly recommend for you to listen to it. So he's obsessed with popular culture. He's obsessed with celebrity, and he loved Marilyn Monroe. And she had just died in 1962 when he paints these silk screens. These are repeated silk screen. These are each individual silk screen paintings. It's a type of printing process. And on one side, you have this very glamorous, sort of timeless image of Marilyn, right? That you'd imagine, this type of glossy, beautiful fashion shoot. It actually comes from a famous film of hers. I think it was called Niagara, which I've never seen. And then this other one, which is more of like, there isn't Photoshop yet, but like the pre-Photoshopped image of Marilyn, which is just a photograph of her. And then she's sort of like ghostly, sort of fading away. This is what the silkscreen process is like if you don't keep adding ink, right? The more you print, the more she's just going to enter into this ghostly realm. So there's this kind of a melancholy aspect to this timeless image of Marilyn, and then the real Marilyn, who probably lived a very different life from what we from the outside. And this seems to be a common theme when people become famous. Like they have their famous persona, and then they have like the real person that they are, that maybe only the people that love them and really know them ever have access to, right? So the idea of celebrity culture is very, very new in the 1960s. So it's almost as if Warhol is already laying claim to this phenomenon. So pop art, working with popular culture. You have something, you also had a movement right after pop art called Conceptual Art, which was art that was more about ideas. Like it understood art to be a concept, And a lot of times conceptual art will be art where it doesn't even need to be made. The idea is enough for it to be a work of art. So someone like Joseph Kosuth was a big theoretician of conceptual art, and he's the one who said that art is a concept and it's an idea. And this is a really wonderful work. It's 1 in 3 chairs. So you have a definition of chair that's on the wall, you have a photograph of a chair, and then you have a physical chair made of wood, right? And then you start to ask yourself, well, which one is the real chair? Which one comes first? What is the concept of chair? Which one is truer to the concept of chair? The chair itself, the photograph of this chair, or the idea of chair as represented in a definition, a dictionary definition. You start to get into this endless loop, this sort of chicken and egg kind of circle, and it's a very fun work to talk about and debate when we're in class together, when we actually have discussions. You also have something like Earthworks, like artists that leave the gallery or the museum altogether, like Robert Smithson. I have no idea why there are 2. This is just maybe something PowerPoint did automatically. I don't know how that happened, but it's just Robert Smithson. He's probably the most famous artist who did earthworks, or it's sometimes called land art. So he left the gallery, left the museum altogether, and he started working with the actual land. He actually started working with the material of our planet and made these large-scale, incredible works. This is his most famous, and it's still there. He made it in 6970. It's called the Spiral Jetty. It's in Utah. It's in the Great Salt Lake of Utah. And if you had it to scale, like my cursor here, my arrow, this would basically be like, you'd be about this big. So it's a massive, massive earthwork, right? And it's this incredible spiral that comes out into the water. And I think you can even see it from space. You can definitely see it from very, very high. So earthworks, we're working with the land in all sorts of interesting ways. In 71, you also start seeing artists who perform, who use their bodies as their medium. So they're no longer making painting or sculpture or photography or even working with the land. They understand their own bodies as the medium of art. And sometimes, like someone like Abrovich or someone like Chris Burden, who you're seeing here, it could be very intense performances, like body art that's really, really intense. They're like pushing the limits of what a body can do. And this is maybe Chris Burden's most famous performance that involved his body, most notorious, and it was just called Shoot from 1971. And he had his friend who had gone to Vietnam, so he knew how to use a rifle. And it's in a gallery, and he asked his friend to just shoot him, but just graze him. Right? He wanted him to actually hurt him. He wanted just the bullet to just whiz by and maybe graze his arm, right? And that would be the performance, right? That would be the art performance. Well, unfortunately, it went a little wrong because rather than simply grazing his arm, it went through part of the arm, right? And he actually had to go to the hospital, and he had to lie about why he was shot. I think he lied that it was like some sort of argument he had with his wife or something like that, because otherwise this whole thing would have been illegal, right? And there are all sorts of different ways to read this work. Like I think because of COVID, we've sort of lost sight of the gun epidemic in this country and school shootings and all these things. Like that wasn't yet a thing so much in 1971, but it's hard not to think of gun violence, which is really terrible in this country, when retroactively interpreting this work. But there are ways in which, Chris Burden said, like there's all this violence in the world, and he's specifically talking about Vietnam at this moment. He's like, there was a way in which this performance also tapped into that violence, like it was bringing that violence home into the gallery in some ways, right? So there's some that might think this is like a frivolous performance, and even insensitive now, right? Because like, why is an artist working with guns? Don't we have enough gun violence as it is in this country? But there are ways in which maybe it can be interpreted in a more positive or like critical manner that has to do with what's going on in 1971. But that's for something to debate. In the mid-70s, you also start to see video art. So artists starting to work with new technologies, believe it or not, at the time, like the Portapack, like a portable recording device. We all have it on our phones now. It's unbelievable, like the way in which we can record anything, and in incredible quality. But if you have someone like Namjoon Paik, an American, Korean-Japanese artist, he's one of the first to really start making works of art that involve video. And there are all sorts of different possibilities of video and installation, moving image practices, right? So this is one of the first, and I love this one. This one's called TV Buddha, and it's a closed circuit television loop, right? So it's a statue of Buddha. The Buddha is being recorded by this Portapack, by this early recording device, and then the image in real time is appearing on this television screen, right? So you have this feedback loop, and there's this wonderful way in which, like a Buddha reaching enlightenment, like being one with himself, and like extinguishing his ego and being like separating himself completely from the desires and from the material world. So you kind of have that, but yet it's also like a deeply narcissistic work in some ways, right? Seeing yourself, and constantly just being preoccupied with yourself. So it's a really fun and interesting work. By the time you get to 1978. You have someone like Cindy Sherman, and you have this incredible wave of feminist artists that really begin in the 60s and pick up a lot of steam in the 70s. So this is the history of feminism. This is the history of striving for equality in society between men and women, and striving for non-discrimination, right? It's really... I have to stop and make everybody aware, especially during this pandemic and this lockdown, the statistics of domestic abuse and the statistics of violence against women. It's really shocking. Once you start just looking at the numbers, or you start doing a bit of research, it's almost crazy that it's not something people talk about every single day, because it's staggering. The level of violence against women in this country, but globally, right? And so this development of feminist politics in the 60s, 70s, and that were, a lot of younger people of this generation, they're picking up the mantle of this feminist struggle and all sorts of other anti-discriminatory struggles, right? It's incredibly important. It's very, very important. And so you start seeing all these incredible female artists, feminist artists, who make this a really interesting work. So Cindy Sherman is probably one of the most famous. She's part of the Pictures generation, beginning in the 70s, and this is still probably her most well-known work. It's one of her first works. It's a series of photographs. They're called Untitled Film Stills, and it's all her. It's like almost a selfie. In each one, she's the one taking the photograph. Often you don't see her holding the cord. Here you see the cord, and I think you can tell in this hand she's like that. So she's the one doing the clicker. So she has control over the way she's being represented. But you notice in each one, and this is only 4 of a lot. There are hundreds. In each one, she's taking on a different idea of femininity, or an idea of a gender construction in society, of what it is to be a woman, right? What it is to be a woman in society. In this case, in the society of the United States in the 70s. And you see all the different options here, right? You have like the young secretary, you have like the pinup girl, you have like the college student in her dorm or whatever, and then you have the housewife. And she's also tapping into the idea of film. There's a lot of ways in which, especially in this one, she looks like Monica Vitti, who's a wonderful Italian film star. She was in a lot of Michelangelo Antonioni. Highly recommended to watch Antonioni films. They're amazing. So she's also tapping into film culture. These are called film stills, right? And you start to get this sense. We need a lot more time to unpack the ideas that are coming from this work. But you start to get this sense that it's as if she's assuming roles, and then you start to think, well, what it means to be a woman is in some ways like something that's performed. It's a role that one is assumed, right? And then you start to think, well, where did these roles come from? Do they come naturally, or are they in some ways like coerced? Are they in some ways are we put upon by the different types of that we need to conform to? And if that's the case, then where do these types come from? Right? I think in the 70s, advertising and film would have been the big ways in which what it means to be a woman or a guy, or all sorts of different things. What it means to be black, what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be all sorts of different things. There's a way in which it's no longer thought as natural, but there are these things that are coded. Like we assume these positions that are in society, that are institutionalized through film or through radio or through television advertising or through magazines, that sort of thing. So for us, this seems a little innocent because now, of course, we live in an internet age, and the different types, the different roles that we can assume or that are thrust on us come from everywhere. So Cindy Sherman is pretty prescient here in the way in which she shows that what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a certain gender, is in some ways a performance, is in some ways something that's assumed, and then other things. It's like there's a way in which it's something that is encoded on us, right? So there are all sorts of different other ways to read this work, but that's one of the ways. It's really interesting. So, 1991. We're getting towards the last few. This is Felix Gonzalez Torres. This is in 1991, so the 80s have come and by. And if there's one thing that's really important about the 80s, especially in the art world, but it's also in society at large, it's the AIDS epidemic and the AIDS crisis. And if you read the history of AIDS activism, and a lot of artists and a lot of artist groups were part of AIDS activism. In some ways, it's an incredible success story. They forced the United States to come up with. This is during Reagan's term in the 80s. They basically forced the United States and the government to help people. Because without it, the government was not doing anything. The government was actually incredibly homophobic and assumed that AIDS was a gay disease. And there was a lot of discrimination, and it was horrible, right? People dying left and right from a disease that they didn't really know about. And so it marked a whole generation of artists, and it marked a whole generation of activists, and of gay rights activists and LGBTQ plus activism. So it's an important history to study. And so Felix Gonzalez Torres was part of this. And he started making these works, these really beautiful poetic installations that seem to not be directly related to sex and gender politics, as I've introduced it. But once you realize what he's doing, it actually is. So it's like this really beautiful oblique work. It's you walk into the gallery, and on the corner, on the floor there's just this big pile of candy. And you're invited to take it. So there's a way in which this work is actually offering a gift. It's actually offering you a gift. So you take the candy, and of course the public keeps taking candy, and the pile of candy throughout the day starts to dwindle. And it's up to the curator. The curator the next day can refill the candy. It's called a candy spill. But what's crucial here is that the candy, before anyone takes any candy, it's the exact weight of his partner. Before his partner contracted AIDS and died. And if you know anything about AIDS and the way it attacks the body, it attacks the immune system, you become immune deficient, you waste away. It's a really horrible disease. And so there's a way in which this gift, this work where the public is taking the candy, it's also this really melancholic, bittersweet sort of homage to his partner, because it's actually dwindling away. And evaporating in front of the public. So it's a very beautiful work, very melancholic, and taps into the history of AIDS in the 80s that really marked a whole generation. And we come to our final two works, which in some ways are still incredibly timely. So when we talk about anti-discrimination, we talk about not discriminating against certain sexual orientations, certain gender orientations, and of course discrimination against women. But the fight against discrimination would be incomplete if we don't talk about the history of racism and the history of racial discrimination, which we are currently in a high point of anti-racial activism in this country, and we're unfortunately also, we seem to be at a high point of racism as becoming front and center within politics and within social discourse. And so you had someone like Fred Wilson, who's an incredible artist. In 1992, he was invited by the Baltimore Historical Society, which was basically, it's a museum that shows artifacts and objects, not really art, like an art museum. Arguably some of it is art, but it's more about like the artifacts of the country, of the nation, right? So things like very beautiful chairs or silverware from the colonial period, the pre-colonial period. It's basically the artifacts, the material culture of the United States and the past, centuries of the United States. And so they invited Fred Wilson to come in and look in its archives, and they said, we want you to recurate our exhibitions and take things out of the archive, out of the basement, stuff that maybe we've never shown that you think should be shown to the public. And Wilson had a brilliant idea, an incredibly incisive idea. He decided to take objects that had to do with the history of slavery, that had to do with the history of racism, and put them strategically in certain parts of the museum. So you had a section in the museum that was cabinet making. So normally when you go into this part of the museum, you would see like beautiful cabinets, you would see wooden chairs and that sort of thing. But with his recurating of the collection, you would walk in and you'd see these beautiful chairs, but then you would also see this whipping post, which was made of wood, right? So a slave would be tied and then whipped and beaten. So you're seeing like the underbelly of violence, and you're seeing the underbelly of racism, which was a big part of the formation of this country, unfortunately, of its economy and of its culture. And he also did it, he did it in a whole bunch of different ways. He really curated the whole collection. But here's another famous image of this, where you have this beautiful silverware, metalwork from 1793 to 1880. So during the making of this metalwork, you had the Civil War, right? And then among this, this beautiful silverware, he's put slave shackles into the vitrine, right? So there's a way in which you're forced to reckon not only with the objects that have so long been deemed to be beautiful and noble, but also the objects that point to the much darker, horrifying, racist history of the United States, right? It's almost as if Fred Conscious is bringing up the darker unconscious of this country through these objects that normally aren't shown, aren't displayed, right? So it's a very, very powerful work, and of course still very, very timely. 1992, right? This is right around the time of the LA riots and Rodney King. So this was also a huge flashpoint for racial politics in this country. And of course, today with Breonna Taylor, with George Floyd, with this whole list of names that we can go down the line, we're also in a new flashpoint of anti-discriminatory and struggle against racism and white supremacy. Which is often encoded in some of these what are often deemed to be, like the valuable artifacts of this country. So it's a very, very powerful work. Fred Wilson was a wonderful artist. And I think I'm going to leave it there, because otherwise it might, I'll leave it with 16 objects. And this is a good one to end on, because of course it's so timely. So I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the 20th century in just 17 objects, and there's so much more to learn, so much more to talk about, so a lot to look forward to.